So here's another video looking at the flight performance data of the L39C in DCS world. So what I checked is the deceleration performance of the aircraft, which tells you a lot about the thrust requirements of the aircraft or of the drag characteristics of the aircraft. Because after all, drag is what decelerates the aircraft. So what I did, again, I took a slice of the flight envelope by decelerating the aircraft from its maximum airspeed, about 215, 210 meters per second, very close to the ground, 500 feet of pressure altitude. I decelerated until I reached stall speed. It took about 150 seconds, and here's how the true airspeed changed over this time period. Again, like in the previous video, the change in true airspeed over time, interesting, but the change in true airspeed over true airspeed is actually a lot more interesting. So what I calculated is the deceleration rate of the aircraft over true airspeed. So while I was flying very fast, I had a pretty high deceleration, and as I slowed down, I had a less and less of a deceleration. And as I slowed down even further, parasite drag wasn't all that much important, but induced drag kicked in, and that's why this graph goes back up. You have more drag flying slow than you have drag flying a little bit faster. So there's two kinds of drags coming into play. One is parasite drag, the other is induced drag, and this is pretty much where the sum of those two are lowest. Again, a pretty jittery line, mountains and valleys in it. So that is because I was climbing and descending while I was flying manually just ever so slightly. And this is my climb gradients that I had during this test flight. So I was climbing and descending ever so slightly during that flight, and I converted that into a deceleration. So how much more could I have accelerated, or how much more could I have decelerated if I hadn't climbed or descended? I subtracted this data from the initial data, and I got this. Just as a comparison, this is what the initial curve looks like, and this is the corrected version. Again, I could have corrected for some more offsets like the G-load that wasn't constant or flight control surface deflections, but I wanted to keep it as down to the data as I could. Now, this is the deceleration of the aircraft over true airspeed. What I can deduct from this is the actual drag that acts on the airframe. So at any point in time, I can multiply the value of deceleration that I get with the gross weight of the aircraft, which was about 9,400 and some pounds, and I get a thrust required. And this is now in newtons. So at any point along this true airspeed, or at any point along this true airspeed, this is the drag, the total drag, so parasite drag and induced drag combined, that's acting on the airframe. And as you can see, this is where you have the lowest drag, and then it's more when you fly slower, and it's more when you fly faster. Again, the line's still a bit jittery, so I asked for a function that would best describe this. Again, I got a sixth-order polynomial, and that is the mathematical formula that best describes this jittery line with as little error as possible. And now that's something that I think one can work with very nicely. And this line, first of all, looks exactly like what you would expect for an aircraft of this type. And there's a couple of interesting points along this graph. First of all, this point right here is the one where you have the least drag. So if you're flying an airspeed of about 90 meters per second, whatever that is in indicated airspeed, at a very low altitude, about 500 feet of pressure altitude is where I did this flight, then you get the lowest drag. If you fly any slower or any faster, then that will give you an increase in drag. If you fly faster, the increase in parasite drag takes over, and if you fly any lower, then the increase in induced drag will make the total drag rise. So this is the lowest drag. I don't have very good data on the fuel consumption of the aircraft, but since jet engines have a fuel efficiency that is almost not changing all that relevantly with airspeed, you can pretty much assume that the straight line is the fuel flow graph. So the point where you have the lowest drag is also, at least it's very, very close to the point where you should have the lowest fuel flow. The lines won't be perfectly horizontal, but it will be very close to here. So if you want to stay in the air the longest, then this is the airspeed you should be looking for. Another interesting point on that graph would be if you draw a tangent line from the origin up to that graph, you reach a point somewhere around here. So that's where the line from the origin has a tangent, or has tangency with that function. And that is the airspeed that will give you the best fuel efficiency in regard to your distance covered. So it gives you the best nautical air miles per fuel used. Again, this is thrust required, but because of the characteristics of jet engines, you can pretty much consider this also to be very, very close to the fuel consumption that is needed to fly at a certain airspeed. So if you want to stay up in the air the longest, then this is the speed that will give you the maximum endurance. It doesn't take you far, but it will keep you afloat for the longest time. If you take the tangent from the origin up to the graph, this is the airspeed that will give you the best nautical air miles, so distance traveled through the air per fuel gallon used. So again, if you want to play a game with your friend, just make a little challenge: who brings the aircraft the farthest, and this speed will get you the best range, while this speed will give you the best endurance. There's something else rather interesting about this curve, about this graph that I noticed, and I'm not sure if you've seen it. It has a nice curviness around here, and it kind of looks like the hook from Nike. But on from here, as you probably noticed, it gets steeper and steeper, and it's a somewhat continuous gradient up to here. But there, it appears as if there was a little bend in the curve, and then it gets steeper and steeper and steeper, and it keeps that steeper gradient up here. So it looks, so something's happening right here. Something increases drag at higher airspeed, and I was scratching my head over this until it kind of struck me. This is what you're seeing right here. So I'm not 100% sure, but this smells a lot like what's called Mach divergence, or a wave drag. So as the aircraft approaches the speed of sound, or 50, 60, 70, 80% of the speed of sound, there's more and more transonic flow on an aircraft. So that's where the drag all of a sudden increases more than it actually should, theoretically. This curve should go straight here. But the difference between the actual curve and what you would normally expect from a smooth line, that's Mach divergent. That means the aircraft is approaching about 60, 70% of the speed of sound, and then these Mach effects, compressibility effects, set on and generate an additional amount of drag, and I'm pretty sure that this is where it comes from. Looking at the speed of about 160, 70-ish meters per second, that's actually rather slow. So I was surprised to see it this slow. I haven't seen the performance data of the actual aircraft. I'm not sure if it sets on this early, but at least I checked for some plausibility, and I looked at the profile of the L39C. That's the profile. And this is the wing profile in a cross section. And this one's literally shouting at me subsonic flow or high subsonic speeds. Just as a comparison, that's the F-16, and this one is shouting at me transonic profile. It's got a maximum thickness somewhere around 40-some%. This one is somewhere around 38% probably. So this is a profile for high subsonic speeds. So it doesn't really surprise me all that much that the Mach divergence sets on at airspeeds that are this slow. I would have expected it later, but hey man, it's still plausible. I'm not sure if the developers are aware or if they have particularly checked for this, and probably it's even a feature and not a bug. But still, I think it's super interesting to see that even these effects are present in DCS world, which again brings me to the point that I've been making all along. DCS is no longer a game. It's really a full-fledged flight simulation. And there's a lot more in it than what meets the untrained eye. So I hope you enjoyed this somewhat theoretical digging through all the graphs. Yeah, I certainly do. So you keep enjoy flying, and then until next time.